Thanks for joining me. I'm Penny Colpin, and this is Belly Flopping into Mysticism. At least that's the title for now. We'll see how long it hangs on. Um, in this segment, I want to talk about an ego collapse. In an earlier segment, I talked about abstract concepts and how that can be difficult because in such a materialistic or materialism approach to science, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, which I don't believe. In fact, based on my experiences, there's a whole realm of abstract involving the mind, the psyche, consciousness, and the ego. So in this segment, I want to talk about an ego collapse, which isn't a very common term. Um, every now and then I come across the concept in some of the older books I read. I tend to come across, I actually look for material that's 40 to 50 years old because for my type of experience, I've come across material and references from that time period that seem to address in a better description what I experienced. And so when I can find resonance in that, that I found to be very helpful. So one of the books that I came across, a friend of mine owns a used bookstore, is The Vital Balance by Carl Menninger. I'd written an article for Mad in America a year and a half ago or so, and I don't remember which one, but in the comments, someone said, "Oh, this reminds me of something out of The Vital Balance." So when I picked it up, this was has a copyright of 1963. It has a very detailed index in the back, and I happened to glance through and I started looking through some different concepts, and one of them was ego collapse. And there was actually an entry for that, which kind of surprised me, and yet it didn't, since this is from the 1960s. And I won't go into all of it, but it says what the ego fears most is a collapse, a general loss of all control and of all identity. A seemingly complete demoralization and disorganization is never a complete disintegration, even though it may appear to, for there's another stage beyond, an extremity of failure and reality separation, which we shall discuss later. And I actually haven't read the rest of this and hadn't come across where he discusses it further, and it isn't referenced as part of the ego collapse, but that describes this role of the ego, and again, this abstract element. In my book, Musings from a Consecrated Mind, I actually included a chapter that includes material from this book called Interview with an Angel, which I get a number of people don't necessarily recognize or believe in that type of thing, but it was suggested to me after I'd had the breakdown. And I'm on the wrong, no, am I on the right page? I thought I had this lined up better. But basically, it says, it is not the insights, knowledge, or level of understanding that is the difference between the two groups of individuals. Basically, the question came up is, what's the difference between, seems those who have a spiritual connection to a spiritual realm seem to have one of two paths. They either become authors of books or patients in mental hospitals. Could you comment? And part of the answer is that it is not the insights, knowledge, or level of understanding that is the difference between these two groups of individuals. Rather, it is the degree to which the experience can be brought back and incorporated into the whole being, back into the ego of that person. And what I said to that is, well, it's one thing if you still have an ego to integrate in with, but if that ego collapses, how do you integrate anything with it if you have something that's in pieces? And so I've shared some ideas that discuss ego collapse, but what is it? And part of the difficulty in identifying that is that the ego itself, what is that? And I could probably have 10 people in a room and we'd all have a slightly different nuance of what an ego is. And even for me, I don't have a firm definition of it. There's a few ways I could look at it as an operating system, a framework that I compare things that allows me to interact with the world around me so that I can interpret things, I can piece things together and function in a physical world. That's one way of describing it. One way, I think it was Freud who described it as kind of a filter between the subconscious or the unconscious mind and the conscious mind. So basically, there's all this processing going on in the unconscious mind, and then it goes through the ego to come to the conscious mind. That's not a bad description. When I came across that in about 2019, I thought, yeah, that describes why, if that ego is not there, I was so much more aware of the unconscious processing. And boy, that gets weird. I shouldn't laugh like that, but and it gets very challenging. I mean, I think that's part of what this process is. Even after the 98 experience I had, I was lucky that a friend of mine who had had these types of experiences used the term spiritual awakening, and he also used the term ego collapse. And I found those two terms very helpful in helping me get through this process. And as I thought of ego collapse, it described that when I was in Banff going through the initial stages of this, there was both an explosion and an implosion. I mean, things were exploding and things were collapsing, and it was a very, very violent experience. And it wasn't till later that I realized, well, I think the explosion was actually a moral injury that hit the contents of the shadow, which is, again, an abstract concept. And all of this trauma and all of this pain and all of this stuff I couldn't figure out, the prolonged experiences of having a brother who was missing, all that gets shoved aside into what Carl Jung would probably call the shadow. Well, something came along and I just kept, over years, I kept shoving stuff aside, which I think most people do. Something came along and whacked that hard enough, and that exploded. And I believe that in that explosion, it knocked out this structured approach, or this ego structure, whatever it is, of how thoughts and how concepts are related, and it fell apart into pieces. That could be called an ego collapse, kind of like how a building collapses or a bridge collapses, or basically something that has some structure and function falls apart, probably under too much strain, and it breaks into pieces. And even that is part of this Kintsukuroi process that I'd mentioned, which is part of the title of my book, Musings from a Kintsukuroi Mind. So the Kintsukuroi process first takes something and breaks it apart. And then, as part of the process, you pull those pieces back together and bring them together with gold. And it's considered more valuable for having gone through that process. So the ego collapse is just the first stage, and a very painful one. Don't ever think I don't say it's not painful, but it's the first stage of a potentially very valuable process, which is what Menninger was mentioning. People like John Weir Perry, The Far Side of Madness, I read that earlier this year, reread that earlier this year. And in several places, he talks about the process of how it's the ego trying to reorganize itself, or something to that effect. So again, this concept of ego collapse, well, maybe that ego that had built up was no longer serving a person. And since our systems don't necessarily recognize, how do we rebuild that? Because this is all abstract. Okay, so even recently I had, again, for my friends, used Bookstore. I go in and hit the spirituality section and the psychology section. And even recently, I mentioned I found one of Fritjof Capra's books in the philosophy section, of all things. But this I came across, I don't know, a year or so ago, and I only read it recently. It's by Radmila Moakkanen. Comes out of the 1980s. Jung's Psychology and Tibetan Buddhism, and basically how they're very similar, which I'd come across that concept earlier. There was a passage towards the end, mentions how Jung repeatedly warns us of the possible dangerous effects when releasing unconscious contents without proper safeguards. What she was talking about is how in the spiritual process, and how mystics train to access these unconscious contents, and how it can be very difficult, and how you need a guide to do it. She mentions kind of like how back in the day you had a ferryman who would help you across a river, or that type of thing. You would have a guide to help you across difficult terrain. And she says, without the proper safeguards and precautions, as it may overwhelm consciousness and cause its collapse, resulting in serious consequences, even psychosis. He compares the potential explosive power to the archetypes to that of the released atom, which I also thought of, even during my experiences, like the forces involved. It's like all of this energy getting released out of your cells that has been stored up. And that ties into Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. But she uses the term consciousness. And so I don't think she didn't really use the term ego collapse in this book, which didn't surprise me. But she did talk about how the role of the ego and how it gets to where it rules, as opposed to being a servant to what Carl Jung called the self. But that bit about not having safeguards and how it can be so dangerous, resulting even in what gets called psychosis, which I have a chapter in the book about reframing psychosis, basically how psychosis talks about being split from reality. But even Einstein said reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. And so the question I come up with then is, if someone splits from what we call this reality, what are they splitting towards? If you're splitting from something, you're splitting towards something else, which goes to different levels of consciousness. You can put consciousness on a spectrum. There's all sorts of different directions to go in this, and I'll probably have more to say about that in future segments. But this idea of the ego, which provides, if you want to think of it in terms of computing, you have an operating system that allows you to function in this world. Well, what happens if something comes along and smacks that, causing it to crash? Well, in terms of a computer, the computer goes down and is no longer functioning. Well, that kind of happens with people if their ego collapses. And there's a difference in terms of, like, if I have a hip joint that collapses, that's not an illness. We don't call them disorders. They're not these magical disorders. Something gave way, something fractured, or something collapsed. And so if the ego does that, which again is more on the abstract side, if all you do is treat the person's behavior through medication or whatever, that doesn't necessarily address the fracturing and injuring process and the collapse state of that ego. So that's why, like I say, Menninger's book that came out in the 1960s, and it was interesting to read because he has a number of references that go back into the 1940s and 1930s. And of course, ego collapse is not in the diagnostic manual because it didn't get voted in. It wasn't popular enough. Instead, things like bipolar and that, because there's nothing in the diagnostic manual that treats these kinds of injuries, these abstract elements, people end up with these misdiagnoses of even schizoaffective and sometimes even schizophrenia for what could very well be an ego collapse, and the system's natural effort to break that apart to build something better. It's not an easy process, and it's not any easier because the system around a person that is supposed to help them with that process isn't well known or understood. So, yeah, thanks for listening. I hope this gives you some ideas. If you know someone who is saying, this isn't what this isn't bipolar, this isn't this isn't that, could very well be an intense, mystical, spiritual experience, where, as Radmila said, a person ended up having a full-on collapse, ended up in these states of consciousness without any guide, without any guardrails and safety measures. That's what happened to me. That's why I call it belly flopping into mysticism. Okay, so the mystics train to go hit these levels of consciousness. And you could say, now, why the hell would they do that? That's a different thing. But I fell into something accidentally that I didn't even know was there. And what's worse is that any number of people that I sought help from either didn't know or didn't believe those states of consciousness exist. I knew through my whole experience this is all happening for a higher purpose. There's a reason behind it. And I believe that my soul, before being born into this planet, was like, all right, we'll sign up for this. I've joked that I had to have been drunk at the time, but whatever. But they were doing a better job of recognizing this back in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, if you look up something like Esalen Institute out near Big Sur, California, they describe it as the human potentiality movement. One of the founders had, and I think both of the founders went to Stanford or Berkeley. One of the founders had this type of experience and recognized the value to it. And that's part of what founded Esalen, is to recognize these different states of consciousness. Now, that was 60 years ago. Why isn't this more widely known? And especially when it was somewhat known. I mean, it's certain there's a plethora of material from that time period. I continually come across more and more resources from that time period, from especially the 60s through the 80s. And that doesn't mean there hasn't been efforts since then. It just has not become broadly enough known. And there are any number of people who are harmed because it isn't widely known or widely enough known. And that's what I want to help do, is, resurrect some of that material, help people recognize there's a process involved. And yes, the initial stages are very frightening, very difficult, challenging, ridiculous, absurd. There's any number of adjectives to use. But when that ego collapses, there is a significant potential for something better to emerge, the concept of the phoenix, rising from the ashes. And a lot of times that ego collapses because of an accumulation of stress, or, think of it as a car, that parts of the car haven't been tended to properly and something breaks down, and then the car can't run. There's any number of better metaphors and analogies that work for this type of experience, that are related to, collapse and breakdown. One thing I will mention is that a couple of years ago, I actually I just Googled ego collapse. And even in the internet, it seems like what came back had more to do with ego death, which is an interesting concept. And I don't know, to me, the ego collapse, I tend to use it a little bit more. But even an ego death means, that old operating system dies, which means something else needs to grow back and replenish in its place. And I think it's natural human tendency. We have to grow some kind of framework, some kind of structure, some kind of system to operate in order to function in this physical world. So the propensity to generate an ego is part of our natural makeup, at least from what I can tell. But I found that concept of ego death also interesting, because even in Banff, in the first 10 days of this experience, I was recognizing this is kind of a birthing process of sorts. I didn't have the verbiage and the terminology, but I honor March 28th. I call it my spiritual birthday. That was the anniversary of the night I was on my knees sobbing near a bed at a motel in Banff, Alberta, sobbing because I was convinced I'd be killed in a plane crash if I got on a plane the next day to return to the US. And that was the point where I would call it a miracle. I felt the souls of two of my friends, Karen and Nikos, pull up behind me, holding me from behind. Nikos was on my right, Karen was on my left, and Nikos was like, come on, Penny, come on, you can do this, you can get out of this, but think, you have a good mind, you have a good brain, you can get out of this. And I remember feeling the synapse fire as I realized, don't get on the plane. So in that state of collapse, and I've often wondered, people talk of the veil between this realm and other realms, but I'd never experienced it like that for whatever reason, that veil opened, and it was astounding to me how easy it was to recognize their energy. And it'd be easy for people to say, well, you just imagined that, or you made it up. And I'm like, no, I sensed it, and then I recognized it. Yeah, I was there. So in that state, even of this ego collapse or ego death, even in the early stages, I recognized, because it was a few days after that, I was like, this is like a birth in a sense. It's, if you think of the process of childbirth, that's chaotic, that's crazy in a sense. It's intense, both for the baby and the mother. So this concept of ego collapse, keep that in mind. See if that helps. If you're going through something, or if you know someone who's going through something, it's not that widely known, but it might very well be a benefit in the long term, even though it's chaotic and difficult and crazy, quote unquote, as part of the process. So I just wanted to share that with you today. I hope you found it interesting. And again, thanks for joining me, and I hope you have a lovely day.